Hey folks, this video is a full mini course on how to get started using Tailwind CSS as a beginner. Tailwind is self-described as a utility-first CSS framework. But what does this mean? Well, in pure CSS, you target the elements that you want to style, usually with a unique class name. And then in your CSS file, you target that class selector, and then add all the CSS style rules for that element. Utility classes, on the other hand, are class names that are tied to just one style rule, which is usually described in the class name itself. These classes are meant to be reused multiple times throughout the website, wherever you need that style. In Tailwind, essentially every possible CSS property and corresponding value has been translated into hundreds of individual class names. So instead of writing multiple CSS style rules targeting your element, you add each of the Tailwind classes that correspond to those style rules directly into your HTML. This has multiple benefits. You don't need to come up with CSS class names for all your elements. You don't need to worry about organizing your CSS styles in order to prevent conflicts. And the reusability means that you won't end up with a bloated CSS file. In addition, because Tailwind comes with pre-built colors, font sizes, breakpoints, and more, you can quickly build prototypes without having to spend a lot of time doing setup. The downside of Tailwind is that you do end up adding a lot of CSS classes to your HTML elements, which can get very long. But I do think that once you get used to the Tailwind approach, it does all make sense. Most of all, because Tailwind is used so much these days in companies as well as in AI-generated code, learning Tailwind and understanding its utility classes is an important skill to add to your resume. And this is the whole reason why I'm making this mini course. In this video, I'll take you from the beginning steps of installing and setting up Tailwind to explaining the most commonly used Tailwind classes, and then finally applying those classes in building a simple, responsive website. Sound good? All right, let's get into Tailwind CSS. All right, to start off, you're going to want to create a new folder for this project. So I'm using Windows File Explorer, and I've already created my folder in my GitHub folder, and I've called it Tailwind CSS Beginners. So once you have your folder created wherever you have it on your computer, next up, you're going to want to open VS Code, which I do have open in the background here. Then to open our project folder in VS Code, I'm going to drag the folder from Explorer to VS Code to now open the folder in VS Code. You can see right now we have an empty folder. There's nothing in it at the moment. Now, alternatively, you can also open the folder using the File menu, Open Folder option, and I believe in Macs that would be the Code menu instead of File. To install Tailwind, we need to use the terminal or the command line tool. So in VS Code, we can use the integrated terminal that they have, and to open it, we can use the keyboard shortcut Control backtick or Command backtick on Macs. And the backtick is on the same key as the tilde or that horizontal squiggly line. It's usually in your top number row before the number 1. So I've opened the terminal, and let's just drag the window up so we can see more. So we have the terminal here. Now let's go to the Tailwind website to get the installation instructions. I'm using the Firefox browser in this video, and if you want to follow along and see exactly everything that I do, you may want to use Firefox, but any browser will work. Okay, so we are on the Tailwind CSS website, which is at tailwindcss.com, and we're going to go to the docs to get installation instructions. Tailwind has really good documentation, and when you are using Tailwind to build a website, I do recommend that you keep the docs open in a tab just because you're probably going to be going back and forth a lot to reference different things. All right, so to install Tailwind, we are going to be using the first option, which is Vite down here. And Vite is a front-end build tool that can run a local server. So we'll just go through this list step by step. So we did create our project folder already, and we want to create a Vite project in this project folder. So we're going to use the command here, npm create Vite at latest. And we don't need to use the my project folder here because this is going to create the folder name. So I'm just going to say npm create Vite at latest. So back in VS Code, I'm going to paste in that command. And we do need to give Vite a location where it will be installed. So we want to install it in this current folder that we're in. So you can say space and then dot for the current location. So I'm going to run this, and I'm basically just going to use all the defaults. So we're just going to use vanilla, JavaScript, we'll do TypeScript. We don't want to do the experimental thing. And then here's where it's different. I don't want to run npm at the moment because I do still want to install Tailwind. So now you can see in the left sidebar, we have all the folders and files that come from the Vite starter project. So let's go back to the website, and we've added Vite. So let's go to the next step, install Tailwind CSS and also the Tailwind CSS Vite plugin. So I'm just going to copy this entire command here, and then we'll go back to our terminal and I'll paste it in and then run it. Okay, so now we have added Tailwind and the Tailwind Vite plugin. So we'll go on to the next step now, configure the Vite plugin. So we need to create a vite config.ts file and then copy this into it. So I'm going to copy the contents of that. And then in VS Code in the left sidebar, I'm going to right click, create a new file, vite config.ts. And then in the file, which is automatically opened here, we'll paste in those contents from the website and then save it. Okay, let's go back to the docs website. So we have added that. So now step 4, we want to import Tailwind into our CSS file. So I'm going to copy this import statement. And then in our project files, we want to go to the CSS file, which is in source style.css. And I'm just going to close the terminal for the moment here. This does come with a lot of stuff from that Vite starter project, so I'm actually going to delete everything and then just paste in import Tailwind CSS. Okay. So next up, we want to start the build process with npm run dev. So let's go back to our terminal here, and we'll run npm run dev. We just want to make sure that the Vite project with Tailwind is working. So I'm going to run this, and now it's running a local server here. So we will control click to open this in our browser. And here we go. And because I did delete all the other CSS, we don't really have anything styled, but you can see that everything seems to be loading correctly. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code, and we want to clean up some of these starter files just because, you know, we're going to be replacing it with what we're building. So let's go to our Solution Explorer, and I'm going to delete counter TS. We want to keep main TS. This is our main JavaScript file, but I don't want to have any of these other sort of extra things. So I'm going to keep the style.css import statement, but I'm literally going to delete everything else. There we go. So that seems good. And then we'll just delete that SVG because we don't really need that. And then let's also go to our index.html file. And I'm going to delete this appdiv. We do want to keep the main TypeScript file because that's what we're using to load our styles from Tailwind. So we want to keep all this here. Okay, so that seems pretty good. So we'll say what we have. Let's just close out of that. And one recommendation that I do have when you're working with Tailwind in VS Code is to install some extensions. So in VS Code, you want to go over here to the extensions tool. And in this search bar, you can search the marketplace for different extensions. Let's type in Tailwind. And this top result, Tailwind CSS IntelliSense, you want to install this because it's just going to make your life a whole lot easier. It includes Tailwind autocomplete options when you're writing your classes, so it just makes things a lot faster. So if you don't have this installed yet, this button will say installed. You can just click that to install. And the other VS Code extension that I'm using is Prettier, which will format and indent your code. So I do highly recommend using that as well. And if you install any of these extensions and it seems like they're not working, you might just need to close VS Code and reopen it in order for it to work correctly. Also, if you want more information on how to use VS Code as well as use VS Code and its extensions, I do have a video called VS Code for Absolute Beginners that you might like, and I do have it linked down below if you want to watch that. All right, so I have kind of adjusted my windows. So I have VS Code open on the left, then I have Firefox with the local website open on the right, and we don't have any content in there at the moment. So in our index.html file in VS Code, let's start creating some HTML elements to make sure everything is working correctly. So I'm going to start by creating an h1 tag, and let's write, let's learn Tailwind. So we'll save that. And now we can see we have the text showing up on our website, which is great. So now let's also start adding some styles. And first I want to change the background color and the text color of the entire website. All right, so we're still in the docs site of Tailwind. And in the left sidebar, if you open this, they have a lot of different sections that are helpful. So if we scroll down, we can see the core concepts section here. And these are helpful explanations of how Tailwind works. So very briefly, Tailwind is an approach to writing styles where instead of writing all your styles in your CSS with selectors to target the different classes, elements, and IDs, you instead have a ton of Tailwind utility classes that have been pre-made for you. So you can see them here in this example code. And each class is basically going to map to one style rule. So using each of those classes for all the different CSS properties and their possible values, you can essentially add any CSS style that you want by adding the correct class in your HTML. So let's go back to the core concept section and let's go to the colors down here. So this is a really handy illustration of all the different colors that come pre-built with Tailwind. So the 500 colors in the middle are basically the base color. And then as the numbers get higher, the colors get darker. And then as the numbers get lower, they get lighter. So let's find a kind of dark gray type color for the background. So here we go, is the grays. So let's try slate. And I'm going to try slate 950, which is the darkest one. And then if you go below the color palette here, they give you examples of how to add the classes for the background color. So what I want to do is add the class BG slate 950. So let's go to our body tag, which is where we want to set the background color. And I'll add a class. And in the class, we'll say BG dash, and you can see that the Tailwind autocomplete is working because of that extension that we have working. So it's really helpful, especially for colors, because you can kind of see the different color swatches. So BG slate 950 is what we want. So now let's save that. Let's go back to our website. And now we can see that the background is indeed very dark. However, we do want to set the text to white because right now they're basically the same color almost. So in addition to the different custom colors that they have, you can also use the color names white and black. So let's say we didn't know the correct class to use that we wanted to change the text color with. So if we go to the Tailwind site, you can search. You can also use the hotkey Control K, or I would imagine Command K for Macs, and then just search for what you're looking for. So let's type in color. And we want to look for where you can change text color. So here, typography, color. So this tells us the different classes that we can add. And then on the right in the purple is the actual CSS that this class is going to map to. So you can see here, if we scroll a little bit, text white will give you a white color. So let's copy that Here's our website again, and I'm going to add it here. So the text white class. And now our text is indeed white. Now, if you haven't used CSS a lot, you might be wondering why the h1 tag is white when we set the color on the body tag. And this has to do with how CSS works, where some properties can be inherited from parent elements. And the color properties are one of those. So this means that setting color, or the text color, on the body tag is going to be inherited down to any child elements unless you explicitly change it on those elements. And most of these inherited properties are going to be related to color, as well as text styles. So you can also have font family, font size, font weight, text alignment, and as well as others. You can set them on whatever parent element you want, not just the body tag. But if you have, let's say a div that contains some paragraph tags that you want to be centered, you can center all of those paragraph tags just by centering on the parent div. Okay, so let's create some more elements here. So under the h1 tag, I'm going to create a paragraph tag with p, and I want to add some lorem ipsum text inside. And you can do this, and this is a VS Code built-in feature. Type in lorem, and then it's going to automatically add some placeholder text, which you can see here. So now we have this on the website. Let's also create an anchor link after the paragraph. So I'll type A, and then we'll leave href blank because it's not really going anywhere. And we'll just say click here for the text. All right, so we have all these different text colors, and you can see again that these are all inheriting the text white color CSS property from the body tag. Now, if you have worked with HTML and CSS before, but not necessarily Tailwind, you might have noticed something a little different. All the elements, the h1, the paragraph, and the anchor tag, are all the same font size. And the h1 tag is not bold, like it usually is with the browser default styles. With pure CSS, the browser is going to apply those default styles to some elements. For example, the h tags should be bold, and they'll usually be bigger than your default paragraph size. And there's also usually a default top and bottom margin on h tags as well as paragraph tags. And then for the link tags or the anchor tags, they're usually going to be underlined and have some different default color, like blue or purple. So none of that is here because Tailwind actually removes all browser default styles so that you start from 0, and then you only need to add in what you actually want. So that's something to remember when you're working with Tailwind. So let's start by styling the h1 tag to be bigger and also to be bold. So we need to figure out the classes that we want to use. So let's go back to the Tailwind docs. We'll do a search, and I'm going to type in font size. This is the CSS property I want to change, so font size. And we can control font size with the class text, it looks like. And also, like with colors, I'm just going to make this a little bigger for now. Tailwind has some preset sizes that we can choose from. So text XS, extra small, small, base, large XL, and then different more and more extra large sizes. And then it also tells you in the right side what the final pixel size is going to be. So 3XL is going to be 30 pixels, 4XL is going to be 36, 5XL is going to be 48 pixels. So let's do 36 pixels, which is text 4XL. And I'm going to add that class to our h1 tag. So in our code, paste that in. And now you can see it is indeed bigger. So let's also make it bold. So again, we'll go to the docs, search for bold, and font weight is what we do want to change here. So it looks like font bold is the class we want. So font bold. And again, with the helpful autocomplete, this tells you the different options that you can use. And also in the bottom, it tells you the actual CSS that is going to be generated here. So we're going to do font bold. All right, so now our H1 tag is bigger and it is bold. So looking at our website, I also want to add some space between the text elements, and I want to add a bottom margin to the H1 tag and also the paragraph tag. So in the Tailwind docs, let's say you didn't know what CSS class that you needed to use. You can actually browse the Tailwind website. They have a really nice outline here in the sidebar. So let's look for where we can add space. So here's layout, flexbox and grid styles. Here we go, spacing. Let's try margin here. So margin uses the class M dash and then different possible values. And there are a lot of options. So let's look at the different examples here. So in this basic example, we can set the class M-number, and then that's going to set the same margin on all four sides using the CSS margin property. Then we can add margin to a single side using MT for margin top, MR for margin right, MB for margin bottom, ML for margin left. So we actually just want the bottom margin. So we're going to use a margin bottom class. And I don't know if they explain it here, but they use this spacing CSS custom property in Tailwind for a lot of different sizing options, like margin. And by default, spacing is going to equal 4 pixels. So M8 is going to be 8 times 4, which is 32. So you can kind of use that to calculate, which margin number you want to add. So let's try margin bottom. And again, we can use the autocomplete. So margin bottom 1 is 4 pixels. Margin bottom 2 is 8 pixels. So it's 2 times 4 is 8. 3 times 4 is 12, and so on. So let's maybe do 20. So that's going to be MB5. So now we can save, and we have our space under our H1 tag. So another really cool feature of the Tailwind IntelliSense extension that we have is if we hover over a class, it's going to tell you the resulting CSS from this class that we added. So you can see margin bottom of 20 pixels for the MB5 class. If we hover over font bold, it'll tell us font weight is set to 700, which is bold. So it's a nice quick way to see what CSS ends up actually getting applied to this element. Okay, so here is a quick tip on adding spacing between multiple elements. So in this section, we have the H1 tag and then the paragraph, and we want to add the same margin bottom to both of them. We could also add MB5 to the paragraph tag, and that would accomplish the same thing. But if you want to be a little more efficient, another option is to use the space class on the parent to add the same space between the elements. So let me show you what this looks like. So I'm going to create a parent element for all these text elements here. So I'm going to create a section tag. This is a semantic HTML tag, and it just designates that it's a section of the website. And I do like to use a section tag when I'm building websites because it just makes it so that you're not using divs for everything, so you can parse it a little bit easier. So let's remove MB5 from the H1 tag. And instead, in the parent section tag, we'll add a class and we'll say space. And again, we can take advantage of the autocomplete here. Let's try space -5. And we just want to add the space vertically. So we're going to say space Y5. So now let's save. And now you can see we've added, if we inspect the code here, we've added the margin bottom to the H1 tag, which we can see in Firefox in the box model diagram here. It's 20 pixels. And we also have the same thing for the paragraph tag. So the dev tools in Firefox are really helpful. So what you can do to use it is right-click anywhere on the website or right-click a specific element you want to inspect, go to inspect, and then you just want to make sure you're in the inspector tool here. And then in the bottom, the layout tab will tell you, the different margin, border, and padding. You can also go to the rules and it'll show you the different styles getting applied, which we will be using quite a bit in this video. Now, going back to the space class that we added, you might notice that we had the margin bottom added to the h1 tag and the paragraph tag, but not the anchor tag. And this is because using that space y class is going to add margin bottom to everything except the last element. So especially if you want to add margin between multiple child elements, like let's say you have a blog post that has, a whole bunch of paragraph tags, you can add the space y class to the parent so that you can add the bottom margin without having to individually go into every single paragraph and add that class. All right, so we have the spacing between the text elements working. And I also would like to center the text. So let's go back to the docs site and search for center text. And it uses the text align CSS property. So we can use the class text center to set text align to center. So because text align is another CSS property that can be inherited, I'm going to add the text center class to the parent section tag. And now all the text is centered. So things are looking pretty good. However, we also need to think about sizing the content. So let me show you what I mean. So on the browser window, once things get really wide, like on a large desktop screen, you can see that the lines of text get super long, and this is not great for readability. So usually what I do is I want to set a max width on the content. And I think I also want to add some spacing on all four sides because you can see that, the text here begins right at the edge of the site. So we would just want to add a little spacing so it doesn't look as cramped. So let's start by adding the max width sizing first. And I'm going to do that by trying to set a width or max width. So if we go back to the docs, let's search for width. And you can set a static width, but we actually want to set a max width. All right, so for max width, we can set it to a number using that spacing multiplier custom property. And they also have preset sizes where, it starts at 256 pixels at 3xs. And let's just make this window a bit wider so we can see everything. And, it goes up all the way to 1280 pixels for 7xl. So usually I'm going to choose this max width to be whatever size I want it to max out for desktops. So let's try the 1024 pixels, and that is the class max W5XL. So I'm going to copy that. Let's go back to our website here, and I will add it to the section tag as well. There we go. So now let's just try zooming out, and this will kind of emulate how it'll look on desktop. So I'm going to zoom out. You can see at a certain point, it does kind of get capped. And this seems a little wide still, so I'm going to maybe reduce it. So instead of 5XL, let's go down to 3XL. If I hover over the class, that tells us that it's going to be 768 instead of 1024. So that looks a little bit better, I think. So if we inspect this element, you can see that it does end. However, if it doesn't go all the way across, I would ideally like it to be horizontally centered on the page. And in CSS, you can do that by adding a margin on left and right of auto. In CSS, that would be using the margin inline property. But let's see how we can do this in Tailwind. So going back to the docs, I'm going to search for margin. And let's go here. Let's just make this bigger. So let's look at the examples and see if one of them does what we're kind of looking for. So this adds margin on all four sides. This adds it to a single side. Here we go. adding horizontal margin. So we want to add it on only the left and the right. And we can do that with mx and then a number using that spacing multiplier. So mx is what we're looking for. And I want to see, we should have an auto option. So I'm going to go back up to the classes. And yeah, here we go. MX auto class. Let's copy that because that will set margin inline to auto, which will set basically a margin on both left and right, and it'll take up all available space. So that means that any extra space that you might have for that element is going to be divided equally on the left and the right, which effectively centers the element. So let's try that. So after max W3XL, we'll add MX auto. So now you can see the section tag has been effectively centered. And it has margin of 5205 on both left and right, which is what we're looking for. So this is pretty good for, like desktop widths, if we make the browser window big like that. But we also want to make sure it's responsive, so we want to check mobile widths as well. So in Firefox, they have a mobile device emulator. If you go into the inspector, which again, you can access by right-clicking anywhere on the website and selecting inspect, it'll open this window. And we want to turn on responsive design mode, which we can do by going to the top right-hand corner here and clicking this icon that looks like a mobile phone and a tablet. So we click that, it's going to turn this on, and we want to select the device we want to emulate. So I'm going to select iPhone 11. So here's the iPhone 11. This is what the website would look like on a mobile device. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit since we're on mobile here. It does seem kind of cramped, and we did want to add that space around everything so it's not right up against the edge. So what I would normally do in CSS is I would want to add space on all four sides of the section tag using padding. Now let's try to make an educated guess as to what this class would be in Tailwind. So let's continue adding classes. So for the section tag, let's try P. So padding doesn't work. P dash, because margin was M, so looks like this will add padding. And again, we're probably using the spacing multipliers, so it means P1 is going to be 4 pixels of padding on all four sides, which we can see down here. Padding of 4 pixels. So I'm going to try maybe P4, and that's going to be 4 times 4 is 16. Maybe 5 for 20. So I'm hovering over the class, and it is P5, which is 20 pixels of padding on all four sides. So let's do that. So it looks pretty good. I might actually add more padding on the top and bottom than I have on left and right. So because we knew that MX is horizontal margin, we could make another educated guess and guess that PX is 5 of 5 is going to be horizontal padding. And let's just hover over this to check. And yes, padding inline, which is padding on the left and the right only. So let's make PY, which is padding block, padding on only top and bottom. Let's do PY12. That's going to be a lot. So 12 times 4 is 48 pixels. Because usually I like adding more padding on top and bottom than we have on the left and the right. So now let's inspect what we have. So here's the section tag. I'm going to go down to the layout tab down here. So you can see we have 48 pixels of padding on top and bottom, and 20 pixels of padding on left and right. So let's also, I'm going to zoom out quite a bit and let's check the desktop widths. So I'm just going to drag the right edge out. And this might be a little small for you to see here, but let's also left align this. We're at about 700 pixels of viewport width, so let's go up to, a little more, a little above 1000. So here's desktop. This is 1100 pixels. So it looks pretty good. And then we can go down to mobile down here. All right, that looks pretty good to me. Just gonna go back to iPhone here. Okay, so next I want to make the click here anchor link look like a button by adding some colors to it. So that's going to be this anchor tag here. So let's add the class attribute, and let's start by adding a background color, kind of like what we did in the body. So that's going to be the BG class. So we'll say BG, and I'm going to look for kind of like a magenta color. So here, fuchsia looks pretty good. So let's try fuchsia 700. Okay, so here's a button, and we do want to add some more space around the button text, which we can do with padding. And I do think padding is the best way to add space inside an element between the content, meaning the text content, and then the edges of the element itself. I like using margin to add space between sibling elements, like what we did with the H1 tag, the paragraph tag, to anchor tag. But again, padding is good for adding space inside an element itself. So let's add padding on all four sides, maybe more on the horizontal sides to make the button look a bit longer, and then less on the vertical. So let's set the vertical padding with PY. And let's do 12 pixels, which is PY3. And then for horizontal, we'll add more. So let's try maybe PY5 for 20. Okay, so that looks good. However, you might notice that the top padding of the button is actually going into the margin from the paragraph, and it's kind of eliminated all the space between them. So if I inspect the paragraph, you can see that the bottom margin is going into the button, and it's basically ending right where that text "click here" begins. So, why are they overlapping? Well, this is actually one example of why it is going to be really helpful for you to know CSS before getting into Tailwind, because this issue is caused because the anchor tag by default is an inline element, which means that its size is going to be set by the amount of content it has, in this case, how much text we have in the button. And also for inline elements, vertical padding and margin on top and bottom, they're not going to push away the elements around them. So that's kind of what's happening here. We have that top padding in the button, but it isn't doing anything to push away the paragraph above it because the anchor tag is by default an inline element. And this is just one of those quirks of how CSS works. So to fix this, I want to make the button be display inline block instead of inline. So let's go to the docs again. I'm going to search for inline block. So it's in the display property. So let's see, inline block, here we go. So the class is inline block to make it an inline block element. So let's add that. I'm gonna add it to the beginning, inline block. There we go. So now you can see the button has moved down and the bottom margin of the paragraph is now pushing away the top padding of the button. All right, so that looks a lot better. The next thing I want to do is I need to add the horizontal padding. Oops, and I made a mistake here. I said PY instead of PX5. There we go. So that looks a lot more like a button. Okay, so to round the corners in CSS, we would use the border radius property. So search for border radius. It looks like we have some preset sizes here. Let's see what we got. So rounded X extra small is 2 pixels. So you can make it kind of be like a square or a rectangle with rounded corners, or I like kind of making them fully rounded, kind of like the button we can see here on Tailwind. And that seems to be rounded full, which will be infinity basically. So it'll be the max amount possible. So let's do that. So on the anchor tag, we'll add rounded full. There we go. So now we have a nicely rounded button. And on VS Code, I'm actually going to wrap the text with Alt-Z so we can see everything. We don't need to horizontally scroll to see all the different classes because we are going to be adding a lot of Tailwind classes to our site here. That looks pretty good. I might even increase the horizontal padding from PX5 to PX7. There we go. Okay, so we have our button. I also want to add a hover state to the button. So when you hover over the button, it'll, change visually. Usually, I would probably make it a slightly lighter color. So we need to figure out how to do hover states in Tailwind. So again, back to the docs. I'm going to search for hover focus and other states. Okay, so it looks like we can add a hover state by using this hover : prefix before the color. This is basically doing what we want. It's changing the color from BG Sky 500 to BG Sky 700. So let's do that. So in the anchor tag, we'll say hover : and we want to change the color, BG Fuchsia. And I'm just going to make it a little bit lighter. So instead of 700, we'll go one step lighter, Fuchsia 600. Okay, so now when we hover, you can see the color changes. And another thing I like to do is make it more smooth by adding an animation transition. So in CSS, we would use the transition property. So let's search for that. These are all different transition properties. We'll just choose one of them. Okay, so it looks like we have some presets here. Transition colors will transition any color property. So color, background color, border color, etc. So that's kind of nice because usually you don't want to transition every single CSS property, meaning if they change, it will change everything. You just want to be a little more selective so that you don't have any unexpected behaviors. So I want to transition just the colors. So let's do that. Transition colors. Let's go back to our site here. Okay, so now the color change is a lot more smooth, which is good. Now with a lot of properties, Tailwind has these handy presets that we've been using, kind of like the ones we've used for background slate and the text colors here, and also some of the sizing like font sizes and margin and padding. However, most likely when you're working on a website, you will at some point probably need a custom number that is outside of those presets. Like you might need a custom color or a custom font size. Thankfully, Tailwind does have that capability built in because in those cases, you can use square brackets in pretty much any property that has those presets. So let me show you what this means. So let's say the paragraph, we want it to be 1.2 rems of font size, which is about 19 pixels. And just as a side note, rems are a better unit to use for font size than pixels because they're more accessible. Because the font size will scale up if you change the browser base font size in your browser settings. So to set this custom font size to the paragraph tag, we'll add class and we'll say text, which adds the font size. But then instead of choosing one of these presets, we'll do a set of square brackets. So inside the square brackets is you can write whatever value you would normally set in your CSS. So in the square brackets for the paragraph, I'll say 1.2 rems. So now when we save, the paragraph text has become bigger, and let's just inspect it to confirm. So in the rules tab, you can see that for the paragraph, we have this custom class that Tailwind has generated, text in square brackets 1.2 rems, and then they're escaping the square brackets with backslashes. And here, font size has been set to 1.2 rems, which is exactly what we wrote here. And let's also say we want to change the body background color to something more custom. So instead of BG Slate 950, we'll say BG square brackets, and then we'll add a hex code 101044. So we'll save. And now you can see the background changed a bit. And if we inspect it, again, Tailwind has generated this custom class, and set the background color property to the value we put inside the square brackets. So later on in the video, I am going to show you how to add custom colors and other styles with themes in Tailwind, which is more efficient than what we're doing here, which is essentially hard coding the values here. But for one-off customizations, I do think the square brackets can be very useful. And you can do this with, sizing width, height, margin, padding, colors, and so on. Pretty much any class that comes with those presets. So just check the docs for the class that you're working with to make sure that you're following the correct syntax. Next up, let's start getting into building layouts with Tailwind. Layouts usually means controlling how elements are sized, positioned, and aligned on the page. And usually you're going to be using either flexbox or grid to lay out elements on your website. So the first example I'm going to show you is with flexbox. I'm going to create a simple top navigation at the top of the website, which will just be a series of text links. So in our code, we want to first create the HTML markup for our top nav. And it's usually best practice to put the top navigation inside a header tag in the body tag. So before the other content, I'm going to create a header tag. And then in this, I'm going to add our navigation links. And the links themselves should be in a nav tag, which is another semantic HTML tag we can use to denote that the content inside the nav tag is navigation information. Then in the nav tag, I'm going to put the links themselves in an unordered list, which is a UL tag. So inside our UL tag, we'll add a list item for each link, so li. And I'm going to use the Emmet built-in plugin in VS Code, where we can designate we want to put inside the li tag with a right angle bracket an anchor tag, like that. So we're going to leave the href attribute blank, and let's just duplicate this a few times. So the first link, we're going to say home. And the next one will be start here. And then we're just kind of going with this learning Tailwind theme for this website. Projects, and then about. There we go. So now on our website, we have our links. And you may have noticed that Tailwind does, again, strip out the default styles for unordered lists so that we don't have those bullet points that you usually see. And we also don't have the padding and margin that get added to the UL tag itself. So now let's start styling the text links. I would like them to all be uppercase, which in CSS we would do with the text transform property and set it to uppercase. And because this is a text style and most text styles can be inherited from the parent, I'm going to set this on the UL tag. So we'll add a class here, and let's just start typing uppercase to see, if it generates anything. It looks like the uppercase class will set text transform to uppercase, which is what we want. So we will save that. And then now we have uppercase links, which is good. Let's also add a little bit of space between each of the letters. And this is the letter spacing property. So let's just try letter. Doesn't look like it is anything. So we'll go to the docs and search for the letter spacing property, which is here. Okay, so this uses tracking as a class name. And the default letter spacing is, I think, 0. So you can make it tighter by making it negative. I think I'm going to go with 0.05 EMs. So EMs is basically 1 EM equals 100% of the font size, because we're talking about text elements here. So that means that 0.05 EMs is 5%, which is usually a good number to start with for letter spacing. So this is with the tracking wider class. So let's add that there. Let's go back to our website. And they kind of got there's a little bit more space between the letters, which looks nice enough to me. Okay, so now let's actually lay out these navigation links. I would like them all to be in the same row next to each other. And I want the first home link, we'll just zoom in a bit here, to be all the way on the left. And then I want all the other links to be basically aligned to the right. So then there's going to be space between the home link and the start here link. And this would be a great application for flexbox compared with grid. Grid is usually what I'm going to use if I want to size the columns to a specific size. Like if I want all the columns to be the same size and I want to kind of force all the content into that template. Flexbox, on the other hand, is really good if you just want to fit the content into, one or multiple rows or columns, and you don't really care what size the columns themselves are. You just want to fit the content. So for the top navigation, because I'm not trying to make the columns a specific size, I just want to kind of fit them in one row, I think Flexbox is going to be a good choice for this. Okay, so when you're using grid or Flexbox, the first thing you want to do is figure out what your parent element is going to be. And then the direct children of that parent element is going to be the flex or grid children. So for our top navigation, the flex children that we want to, lay out are going to be these list items. And then their parent element is the UL tag. So this is going to make the UL tag the flex parent. So let's go to the docs and let's search for Flexbox. So in CSS, we want to set display to flex. So let's try display flex. There we go. So use the flex utility class to create a block level flex container. So here we go. So let's add that to the UL. And now we have all our links on the same row. We do want to add space between the links, and in CSS we would use the gap property for that. So let's search for gap. There we go. And it looks like it's kind of like the other sizing properties like margin and padding, where we can use the spacing multiplier. And then we can do gap X for horizontal space between items or gap Y for vertical space. So let's try gap dash, let's do 4 for 16 pixels of gap space. Okay, so now we have our space. And I think I'm going to make the font size a little bit smaller than the default 16 pixels, which is what we have here for these top nav links. So again, in the UL tag, let's add text. And we had some presets of, I think, starting from extra small. So let's try small. Small is 14 pixels, and that seems to be pretty good to me. So let's do that. All right, so now the text links are a bit smaller. So we now want to make the first home link all the way to the left and then the other links all the way to the right. In Flexbox, we could do this with justify content space between. So let's try adding justify. It looks like it is a Tailwind class. And then justify between, we'll do space between. So this is going to add all the available space between the link items and no space on the outside edges, which you can see. However, we want all the space to be between the first and the second link. And here's a little trick that you can use. We can do this by setting the home link, the first list item here, to have a margin right or margin inline end of auto. And this auto margin will basically take up all available space, kind of like what we use to center the wrapper for the content below there. So adding a margin right of auto to home will essentially push these other 3 links all the way to the right. So for the first list item, we'll add a class, and we can do margin right. You could also do margin inline end, which I believe margin inline end of auto. And it does the same thing as margin right. You can just use margin inline end if you want to use the logical properties for CSS. So we'll do that. There we go. So now let's inspect this. You can see that all of the available space has been added after the home link, which is now all that margin there. So the spacing between the links looks good. However, these are crunched all the way to the left and right edges. So I want to add the same styles that we'd added to the section tag. So, and I also want to center them on large desktop widths, because right now, it's going all the way across. So we want to do that max width thing and then also cap the max width. So let's copy these classes from the section tag. So I want to copy the max width and then MX Auto to center it. And then maybe the padding classes too, just to add some padding. So let's do that. We're going to add it to the header tag because, the header and the section tag are on the same level. So kind of want to be consistent here. There we go. And I think the PY12 is going to be a little too much for us. Yeah. So let's make it smaller. Let's try PY3 to be 12 on top and bottom. All right. So now we have the same spacing around the header as we do for the content below it. And then let's see how it looks on desktop. There we go. So now we hit that max width and you can see all the extra space is on the left and the right. So they're all spaced correctly. So let's also test for smaller mobile widths. The iPhone 11 has a viewport width of 375, but I know that some older iPhones can go down to 320. So let's see how that will look. Okay, so here's 320, and the start here link is wrapping, which kind of looks a bit weird. And also we can inspect the flexbox container to see kind of what's going on. So here's the UL tag, and we can click this flex label. It's going to show you lines. If we go to layout in the bottom here's a flex container. So you can see we can choose the color of the lines, and each individual flex child is in one cell, and you can see the gap space between them has this shaded stuff. So I'll just zoom in so you can see that better. So, things are looking a bit crunched, which is weird. One thing that we can do to kind of fix this is to allow the flex box to wrap. So this means that when you start running out of horizontal space, it's going to wrap the flex children to the line below it. Because by default, flexbox is going to try to fit all of them on the same row, so wrapping's turned off by default. So what we want to do is in the flex parent, which is the UL tag. So let's start typing flex wrap. Oh yeah, here we go. Flex wrap, we'll turn on flex wrapping. So we'll save that. And now the links are wrapping the two lines, but the spacing is now looking a bit strange. So I think that margin inline N that we added on the home, I only want that to get added on desktop widths and not for mobile. So this means we need to start getting into responsive styles, meaning having a different set of styles getting applied to different screen sizes. To do responsive styles in CSS, we would use a media query. This is a CSS feature that lets you set styles to only get applied to a specific condition. So let's go to the docs and look up responsive and go to responsive design. So every utility class in Tailwind can be applied conditionally at different breakpoints. So these are different viewport widths that you can target. So let's see what the breakpoints here are. So here are the prefixes. So small is going to be 640 pixels and up. So because you can see width is greater than or equal to 40 rems, which is 640 pixels. And by default, Tailwind styles are going to be, you can think about them as being applied to mobile sizes. So starting from 640 and up is going to be these media queries. So medium is 768, large is 1024, and we got 1280 and 1536. So let's see how to use these. So to use a media query, you basically write the breakpoint prefix. So this is medium, and then colon, and then whatever the utility class you want to apply. So with that in mind, we want to get rid of that margin inline end or margin right on the home for, devices larger than mobile. So I think we can use this small breakpoint for that. So let's go back to our styles here, and we'd added the margin inline end of auto here. So now we're going to prefix this with SM for small and colon. So now when we save, you can see that that extra margin kind of went away. So let's just see how it looks. There we go. So now the space is even between them, and once we hit 640, which is here, you can see now this is where the margin inline end of auto starts kicking in. We can see this if we inspect that home link. Down in the rules tab, we have the ME auto for this breakpoint of 40 rems. So once we get below that, then the links are evenly spaced. So below 640, I think I would like to maybe center the links. So in the UL tag, I'm going to have the justify between be for, again, small, so sizes of 640 pixels and above. And then for mobile, we'll do justify center. This will center all the links inside the flexbox parent. So now here we go. So here is iPhone. So here the links are centered. And then once we hit 640 is when we get the extra space. So that looks pretty good. And then for really small mobile widths, we have this. And right now, if we inspect the flexbox parent, we have the gap that we added. It's the same between columns, so between the individual links, and then it's also the same between rows. And I think I'd like to make this a bit less between rows. So what we did was we added gap of 4, and this is getting applied for X and Y directions. So let's just do this for the horizontal X direction. And then for the vertical gap, let's say gap dash Y. And let's just do 1 for 4 pixels. So now on our mobile website, the space between the rows is a lot smaller than the space between the columns. So there we go. So I think that looks a lot better. Cool. Okay, so I think our top links look pretty good. The next thing we want to add is some hover states for these links. So what I'm going to do is when you hover over a link, let's add a magenta background color, kind of like the same color that we have for the button. It's just going to be around that individual link. Now you want to set the hover state on the anchor tag itself because this is the element that is clickable. So let's try just for the first one, we'll add a class. And then let's say hover and BG Fuchsia 700. Okay, so now when we hover, you can see we have the magenta link. And let's also add the transition colors. There we go. So now it's a bit of a smoother animation. Let's also add a little bit of padding just to add more space around the link. So I'm going to say P1 for padding of 4 pixels. There we go. Let's also round the corners. So rounded, let's try small, which is 4 pixels of border radius. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now let's, we need to add all these classes to the other anchor links. So let's copy this class attribute and let's add it to the other anchor links. There we go. And it is a little bit annoying to have to copy and paste the same set of classes multiple times. But just keep in mind, if you're doing a real world project, you're more than likely using some kind of framework to generate the list of items. So you would only have this code kind of exist in your code base one time, and then the framework would generate it for however many links you have. So you shouldn't have to do this copying and pasting thing too much if you're using a framework. It's just because I'm using a static website here that I need to duplicate these classes. Okay, so, yep, all the links have the hover state, which looks pretty good. Okay, so next up, we're going to create some more content in the main part of the website. Okay, so let me fold up this header tag, and we are going to create what's called a hero section. So this is just a marketing term for the top section of a website. Usually it's going to have a big picture with some text, either telling you what the website is about or a promotion that the company wants to have. So that's why it's called the hero section. So for this basic website, I'm just going to add an image to go along with the text that we already have. And then we're going to be making the image and text responsive in terms of layout. So for the mobile layout on mobile, we're going to have, the image and text be in one column, and then we're going to go to a 2-column layout for desktop widths. So first, I have added an image to my project folder in the public folder. So it's this waterfall image that I got from Unsplash. So you can get whatever image you want to use and just move it into the public folder. And I guess we don't actually need this SVG file either, so I'm going to delete that. So here's the image. And let's add it to our markup. So in our HTML, before the h1 tag, I'm going to add an image tag. And then for the source attribute, we want to load the waterfall image. And I'm going to make the alt text just say waterfall. And we also want to set width and height attributes so the browser knows how much height to leave for the image while it's still loading. And this will avoid content shift, shifting down once the image file gets downloaded, which is not a good user experience. So let's open the sidebar and load the image. And I also want to make sure I'm loading the status bar at the bottom. So I don't know if you can read that down here, but it says it's 2200 by 1331. So let's add those. So the width was 2200 and height was 1331. There we go. And I also wanted to point out a few defaults that Tailwind adds to image tags. So let's inspect the image tag. And we want to go down to the rules. So below the spacing, here we have some base image styles. So first off, it has some styles that you do always want to add when you're working with image tags. It has a max width of 100%. This will prevent large images from being super wide and causing horizontal scrolling. And then we also have the height set to auto. This is going to make sure the image has the correct aspect ratio as the width changes so it doesn't get kind of skewed. Then below that, it looks like image tags are set to display block. And this is another style that I personally like adding on all my images because it gets rid of a tiny little space that browsers add to the bottom of all inline elements. And for whatever reason, image tags are by default display inline, whereas most other inline elements are text. So for text elements, you do want a little space at the bottom because it leaves space for those lowercase letters that go below the baseline, like lowercase p, q, and so on. And this is just kind of a quirk from back when the web was invented. So yeah, you do want to usually set your images to be display block. So this is another instance of where Tailwind kind of takes care of some of these CSS quirks so that you don't need to worry about them yourself. Okay, next, let's also make rounded corners. So we're going to add a class and we'll say rounded. And I don't want it to be fully round like the button, but I do want the corners to be, fairly rounded. So this rounded 2XL is 16 pixels. Maybe I'd like a little smaller than that, like 12 or so. So let's go less than that. Let's try XL. This is 12 pixels, which looks good to me. So let's save that. So now the image has slightly rounded corners. It's not super rounded. All right, so we have our image and we have our text. Now we want to make our responsive layout, and I am going to be using grid for this. And the reason for this is because, like I said earlier, for grid, it's good for layouts where you want the columns to be specific sizes, and I do want that. For desktop widths, I would like the columns will have the image in one column and the text in another column next to each other, and I want them to be the same size. So layouts like this are better using grid. So we need to identify what we want the grid parent to be, and we probably want it to be the section tag because the section tag contains the image as well as all the text elements, the H1P and the anchor tag. So I want to kind of handle all the text elements together. So I'm going to make life easier for myself and put them in a div. So I'm going to create a div and I'm going to put all the text elements inside that div. So let's select them and move them up inside the div. Okay, so that looks good. However, we did lose that spacing that we added between the text elements from the space Y5 class. So I'm actually going to move that into this div. There we go. Okay, so now the spacing is back between the text elements. All right, so we have our section tag, which is going to be the grid parent, and then the children are going to be the image tag, and then the div that contains all the text elements, kind of like this. So let's start with our mobile styles. So in responsive design mode, I'm going to select the iPhone just so we can see what it looks like on mobile. And we want to start adding our grid styles. So I'm going to go back to the Tailwind docs and let's search for grid. And display grid is kind of what we're looking for here. All right, so here it looks like we set the grid class on the grid container or the grid parent. And then also on the grid parent, we are going to designate how many columns and or rows we want, which we're going to do for desktop a bit later on. And then we also add space using the gap property. So this is pretty similar to what we did with the top nav using flexbox. Okay, so I'm going to move this over here. Just kind of keep this for reference. So in our grid parent, the section tag, I'm going to add grid. And we're going to add our space with gap. Let's say gap, let's do gap 5 for 20 pixels. All right, so now when we save, we can see our mobile site, and you might notice now a space has been added between the image and the text. So let's inspect that. And here's our grid parent, and we're going to turn on grid highlighting. And let me change the color of those lines. For some reason, it always defaults to purple, which is not good with this background color. There we go. So hopefully you can see that a bit better. So we have our grid with, you can see this diagram down here in the Firefox tools, and we have the two children, the image, and then the text div. And we can see there's space between them coming from that gap property. So yeah, the grid inspector is pretty helpful when you're trying to debug what's going on with grid. So let's turn off the highlighting for now. And this is our mobile view, and that looks pretty good to me. So let's now go to our desktop view. So we want to get, maybe closer to 1,000 pixels, which is around here. And here is when we want to have 2 columns. So if we go back to our grid in the docs, we can create 3 columns using the class grid calls 3 here. We just want 2 columns, so grid calls 2 should be what we want. So let's go back to VS Code. So in our section tag, grid calls 2. Now when we save, we have 2 columns on our website, which is what we want. Now the other thing I want to do is I would like to vertically center the image and the text to each other, because right now you can kind of see that we have the 2 children and they're aligned to the top. So I'd like to move the image down a little bit so it is vertically centered. There we go. So in CSS, we would use the align items property. So let's look that up in our docs. Align items. Here we go. And we would set it to align items center, which is here. We can do that with the class items center. So let's go back to our code, items center. All right, so now the image is vertically aligned with the text like that, which looks a lot better. So let's see how this looks. This looks good on desktop. I feel like it's maybe a little bit narrow because right now the max width has been set to 768. I'm going to make that a little bit wider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the max width 3XL to, let's try 5XL. It's going to be 1024, just so it'll be a bit wider. Yeah, so that looks better for desktop, and we'll have to do the same thing to the header. So instead of 3XL, it is 5XL. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. All right, so this is our desktop layout, and that looks pretty good. However, some of you might have figured this out already. It's now always going to be 2 columns because we don't have any responsive styles happening here. So kind of like what we had earlier with making the home link have the small colon breakpoint, we can do a similar thing for our grid layout. So for our grid layout, what I would like is I want the 2 column layout to only happen on desktop widths. And for mobile, I want it to be 1 column. So we need to add our breakpoint. So let's go back to the docs, search for breakpoints. I think here's what we want. We don't need custom ones at this point. Here we go. So I think I'm going to do maybe the large breakpoint for the grid. So at 1024 and up is where we'll have 2 columns. So that means we need to go back to our section tag and figure out which classes we want to have be with this large breakpoint. So grid columns 2 is where we make the 2 column layout. So I'm going to say large colon and save that. So that means that the 2 columns is only going to apply when we're above 1024 pixels. So let's test this out. Yeah, so now we go back to 1 column and it breaks to 2 columns when we get above 1024. So it looks pretty good. And one more thing I would like to do for desktop is when we are in the 2 column layout, I would like the image to be on the right. So I want the text to be first and the image to be second. But for mobile, when they're stacking, I want the image to be first. So we can change this by using the order property in CSS and for desktop. So let's just double check. We're going to search for order. Okay, so order and then number. So usually in CSS you would say order and set it to 1 or 2 or whatever you want the order to be. So for the image, I want it to be order 2 on desktop. So we will add our breakpoint of large, order 2. So now on desktop, the image is second, which is on the right. If we go down below, it's going to be order 1 because it's following the natural order that we have in our HTML. And we're changing the order in CSS for our desktop layout. So one more thing that I think I want to change is this width. It just seems like really wide and it's making the image really big too. So I think I want to adjust the max width for when we're in one column layout. So for the section tag right now, it's at max width 5XL, which was 1024. But let's maybe set that for just the large breakpoint. And then for other viewport widths, we'll have a max width that's less, maybe 3XL for 768. Okay, so that's a lot better. So now here's our mobile, tablet, and then desktop. So it looks pretty good. All right. Okay, I'm going to close out of responsive design mode and just zoom in a bit. And next, we are going to create some cards because cards are a very common design pattern. And we are going to use grid again for them, but we're going to use grid in kind of a more advanced way than we have in the past. So going with the Let's Learn Tailwind topic, I'm going to make these cards different links and resources related to Tailwind. And we're going to start by first creating all the HTML and the content, and then we'll add our styles after that. So this is going to be in a new section. So I'm going to create a new section tag. Let's just fold up this previous one. So we'll create a section tag, and this is going to be the grid parent, which will contain the cards. And because we know that we want to reuse some of these styles that we've created already for the max width and centering, so I'm going to copy what we already have from the first section tag. And I don't want to align text to center, so we'll skip that one, but we are going to start copying the max width ones as well as the centering. And let's keep the padding as well. And let's take the grid classes as well. And then I don't think we need to vertically align the cards, so we'll skip item center. So copy these classes, paste them in our new section tag. And for these cards, I'm thinking we'll have maybe 5 cards, and I want them to be in 3 columns on desktop. So let's adjust our grid template here to be 3 columns for desktop. So here is the classes for this new section. So we're going to start by creating an H2 tag to head up this section. And the reason that we're doing this is that semantically, you really want to have a title for each section of the website. And you can think of the different H tags on the site as kind of an outline of the information in the site. So the H1 tag, Let's Learn Tailwind, is what the entire website is about. And then each section on this hypothetical web page would be what each section is about. So in this new section, we're going to say H2, and I'm going to say resources because I'm kind of pretending like these cards are going to be different resources about Tailwind. Now let's create the markup for our first card. So I'm going to create a div, and then we're just going to start by creating the content. So each card is also going to have a title, and we're going to make this an H3 tag. And this is because with the H tags, you want to go in order of like prominence. So the H1 tag is for the whole website. The H2 tag is for the individual sections. And then the H3 tag is going to be the card in this section. So let's make up a title. We'll just say, what is Tailwind? And below that, let's make a paragraph. And inside the paragraph, we'll add some lorem ipsum text, maybe just 10 words. There we go. And then below that, let's create an anchor link. And we're going to make the text say read more. There we go. So here's our card content. And just for the sake of this video, I'm going to add padding to the bottom of the body so I can scroll up so you can see the cards not at the very bottom of your screen. So let's go back up to the body and we'll say PB for padding bottom, and we'll hard code 50 VH. So that's 50 viewport height units, which means it's going to be 50% of the overall height of your browser window. So now we can scroll up and you can see our card content. All right, so I'm going to zoom in a bit more. And this is the content that we need for our card. So next, let's start adding our styles. And let's go back to responsive design mode, and I'm going to emulate a mobile view with the iPhone. Okay, so let's start with the H2 tag. So this is the H2 tag, and we want it to be bigger and also bold. So let's add class, and let's go back up to the H1 tag and just copy the classes that we want to reuse. So here's the H1 tag. We did text for Excel and then font bold to make it font. So we'll paste it into the H2 tag. And I want the H2 tag to be smaller than the H1 tag. So let's say maybe 3XL to be smaller. All right, so there we go. And then let's start styling the card itself. So in the div, which is going to be the card, we'll add a class, and let's start by adding a background color. So I'm going to say BG dash, and I'm going to filter for the 800 colors to be darker. So let's try blue 800. Okay, and then let's also go to the H3 tag, and we also want this to be bold and just a little bigger than the defaults. So font bold, and let's also do the size. So text 2XL is 24. It's a little large. Let's try text LG for large. 18 pixels seems good. So it's just a little bit larger than the default text. Okay, so that's good for the title. I think the paragraph is probably fine as it is. Now we want to style this read more link. So class, and let's make it bold as well. So font bold, and let's also make it a different color. So maybe a fuchsia color, but lighter. So let's try text fuchsia, and let's try 300. All right, looks pretty good. And let's also add some space between the elements in the card. So we're going to use the space class for that on the parent div. So space Y to add space, vertical space between the elements. And using the multiplier, it's going to be 4 times maybe 2 for 8 pixels between each of them. Okay, looks good. And let's add some padding inside the card to add space around the text. So let's say P for padding, and then let's try 3 for 12 pixels of padding. Let's also round the corners while we're here. Rounded, let's see, small is 4 pixels. Let's try medium, 6 pixels maybe. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so there we go. So we have our padding, and we added some slightly rounded corners. So we're off to a pretty good start, but let's make the background color of the card a little more interesting by adding a linear gradient. And this is a CSS feature. So let's search for gradient, and we want linear gradient, the first one. So linear is a gradient that changes colors in a linear direction, so moving from one side to the other, as opposed to a radial, which is circular, or a conic, which is a cone-shaped direction. All right, so looks like we create it by saying background linear, and then we have the direction. So to R is going to be to the right. So from the left to the right. And there should be other directional options here. Yeah, so you can see here we have to right, to top. So going from bottom to top. Then we have to bottom left. So going from the top right to the bottom left. And then you can set a number, which is, I'm assuming, like a degree direction. And then, so after you set the direction of the gradient, you set the colors. So by default, we have two options. We have the from color, which is the initial color, and then to color, which is the second color. So let's make our gradient go to bottom left. So we want to set this on the div, and I'm actually going to leave this BG blue. This is going to get set on the background color property. Linear gradients are set on the background image property. So it's good to have the background color as a fallback in case something goes wrong with the linear gradient. So we'll say BG linear to BL bottom left. Now we want to set our colors. So the first one is going to be from. And let's use maybe a purple color. I'll say purple. Let's do kind of dark, so 800. And then to, and let's say blue, 800. There we go. So let's save that. And here's our website. And now you can see we have a gradient that goes from the top right, purple, to the bottom left, blue. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so next let's also add some hover states to the read more link here. And I'm going to start by changing the text color to white on hover. So in the anchor link, we'll add hover colon for the hover state, and then we'll change text to white. And while we're here, let's add the transition colors so that it's a smooth color change. All right, so now when we hover, you can see it changes colors. Okay, so this is basically the markup for our card, and it's pretty complete. So I'm now going to duplicate this card div, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So we'll have 5 cards total. So here we go. Here's our cards. So it looks pretty good. Let's also center the H2 tag. So we'll go back up to the H2 and we'll say text center. There we go. All right, next let's work on the responsive grid. So right now we have our grid at 1 column on mobile, and when we increase the viewport width, let me zoom out so you can see better, it changes to 3 columns on desktop. And this is from this large breakpoint where we set grid columns to 3. And let's say we wanted to have 2 columns on tablet and 3 columns on desktop. We could add, another breakpoint here for medium widths to set grid columns to 2. However, with grid, you can use a bit more of an advanced feature called autofit, where you give it a range to size the columns, and then the browser will dynamically decide how many columns can fit in that row at any given viewport. So with autofit, you don't need to use media queries, which is kind of nice. So let's do this for the grid columns. And I'm going to delete the large breakpoint, and then instead of 3, we're basically going to be adding kind of inline CSS in these square brackets. So again, grid calls will set the CSS property grid template columns. Usually you would set it to a number for the number of columns. So we're going to start by, instead of a number, we're going to add the repeat function. This is a CSS function that's used in CSS grid. And we can use this because if you want multiple columns, you would need to write the number of columns and then the size of the columns. So we're going to start with a static number. We'll say 2 columns, and then we'll add a comma, and then we want to write the size of the columns. And I'm going to write the size as 1FR. So the FR unit is a CSS unit used in CSS Grid, and with FR, it's going to divide the available space among the number of columns that you have. So here we're creating 2 columns, and they're each going to be sized at 1 FR, which means they'll be equal size to each other because the space will be divided equally among them. Also, one really big thing to note with Tailwind is that you cannot have any spaces in the class names. So usually in CSS, I would actually add a space after the comma, but you don't want to do that here because this will prevent Tailwind from actually parsing the class. So let's save what we have. And now in our grid, we have 2 columns. And if we wanted 3 columns, we could say 3. And there we go. So now let's make this more dynamic by now adding autofit. So instead of 3, I'm going to set the number of columns to autofit. And this is a CSS feature. So it's not like a Tailwind thing. So now with autofit, the browser is going to decide how many columns can fit in the available space, depending on the size of the columns. So right now, autofit 1 FR, we're just going to have 1 column all the way across. So we need to add some more kind of complexity to our autofit grid in order to have those dynamically numbered columns. So we're going to do this by, instead of 1 FR, we're going to actually use yet another CSS function called minmax. And with minmax, it takes 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be the minimum size that you want the columns to be, and then we'll add a comma, and then the second parameter is the maximum size that we want the columns to be. So when you're using minmax to make, a grid like we're doing here, you usually set a static number for the minimum size. So we're going to start by setting the minimum to 220 pixels. So the columns have to be at least 220 pixels wide. Then after the comma, and again, no spaces, we want the maximum size to be 1 FR. So this means it'll take up all available space, which means that it'll just be allowed to grow in order to fit all the columns on the row. So now let's save. In the browser, at our desktop width, we're at 1043 pixels viewport width. So the browser has decided we can fit 4 columns that are at least 220 pixels wide in the grid. And as we decrease, it goes down to 3 columns, and then 2 columns, and then 1 column. So we go from 1 to 2, 3, and then finally 4. So this is pretty great. We have our responsive grid, and we didn't need any media queries. We just used autofit and minmax. So one other thing to note is that when we're sizing elements, like setting the column width, it's better accessibility-wise to use rems instead of pixels. So, this is the same thing that I do with font size. You want to stick with rems so that users can use the browser-based font size in their settings to make things scale up. So instead of 220 pixels, let's convert this to rems. So to do this, I know this is a little bit awkward, but you have to do a little math. And 1 rem equals 16 pixels. So 220 divided by 16 gives us 1375 rems. So we'll replace this with rems. There we go. Okay, so we got our grid going here. Looks pretty good. I'm just going to zoom in a bit so we can see better. And I'm going to right click and let's turn on the grid highlighting here. So one thing that I would like to do is I want to make the resources H2 tag extend the entire width of the first row. And this is a little tricky because the number of columns changes. So with grid, you can use grid lines to place a grid child anywhere you want in the grid. And how this works is we would use in CSS the grid column property. And with grid column, you could designate a start line and an end line. So I'm going to zoom in more so you can see the lines. So in our grid template, we have lines for columns and also for rows. So we're mainly concerned with the columns for this grid. So the column lines are numbered starting at 1 at the very left, and they go up to 2, 3, and then 4 on the right side. So for this 3-column grid, we would want the resources to start at grid column line 1 and end at grid column line 4. However, since the number of columns can change, when we go down to 2 columns, the last line is grid line 3. So this kind of runs into an issue where we can't designate the last line effectively for this dynamic grid. Fortunately, we can solve this because there's also a negative numbering system. So if we look at the bottom, the grid column lines are also numbered starting at -1 on the very right side, and then they go down. So -2, -3, -4 as you move to the left. So for the resources H2 tag, we want it to start at grid column line 1, and we can say we want it to end at grid column line -1 because every line has a positive and negative number. So this is really helpful when you want something to extend the full row. You can say start at 1, end at -1. So in CSS, this would be the grid column property. Let's go to the Tailwind docs and figure out what that is. So grid column, here we go. So we're using the call span class, which tells us how many columns we want each grid child to span. And you can see here, grid column starting at 1 and ending at -1. We can do that with the class call span full. So let's do that. Let's go back to our code here. And for the H2 tag, we want to add call span full. And this is added on the grid child itself. So it's not added on the parent like the other grid style that we've been adding. So now we'll save. So now the resources H2 tag is spanning the entire first row. And let's test it at different viewport widths. So here's 4 columns and it's still on the first row. 3 columns, 2 columns, and 1 column. All right, so this is looking pretty good. I think I might want to add just a tiny bit more space under the H2 tag before the cards begin. So let's go to the H2 tag and we'll say margin bottom, and let's do margin bottom 4 for 16 pixels. There we go. Okay, that's a little bit better. All right, so our cards are pretty much done. And, we have a pretty good little website going on here. Now, so far, we've covered what I consider the most commonly used classes in Tailwind that you'll need for basic websites. However, you can make Tailwind even more powerful with some customization that you can add to it. So in the next section, I'm going to show you how to add custom styles in themes and also use some more advanced features in Tailwind that you can use to make your project styles even more efficient. So we've covered how Tailwind comes with a lot of styles out of the box. However, it is very likely that at some point you're going to want to use some custom styles, for example, custom colors. Now in our website, we had hard-coded the background color on the body tag, and it does work fine. But let's say we wanted to reuse that color in other parts of the website. You can, of course, copy and paste it to whatever element you want, but it would honestly be more efficient if we could map that custom color to its own Tailwind utility class. Fortunately, you can do just that by creating a theme in Tailwind, which can contain styles for not just colors, but a lot of other properties as well. So I'll start by going to the docs per the usual, and let's search for theme. And we'll go to theme variables. So if we go down to the example code here, under the import Tailwind CSS, we can see that we have a @theme directive. This is a Tailwind thing, and in it right now they have a color mint 500. This is a CSS custom property. And we're basically creating this new custom property inside the Tailwind theme and then setting it to a color value. So let's do the same thing in our styles. So I'm going to write @theme. And then in here, let's create our CSS custom property for that background color. So we'll say double dash, because that's how CSS custom properties all start. And then the custom property name, and let's say color. So we're kind of following the same pattern as the other colors in Tailwind. Dash, I'm going to say dark dash blue. Now, one thing to note for colors, we do need to name it starting with color, not just to be consistent, but also this is the only way that Tailwind can detect this as a color and then allow us to use this color in the other utility classes like BG for background colors or text for text colors. Okay, so now we want to paste in our color. So I'm going to copy this hex code and then paste it in here. Now for colors, you might have noticed that Tailwind uses the OKLCH color format. This is going to display colors closer to how the human eye perceives them in terms of saturation and lightness. And they are better for making gradients that look nicer and less muddy than other color formats when you're blending the colors together. So just to stay consistent, let's convert this hex code to OKLCH. Now in VS Code, we can convert colors, but because the VS Code is not recognizing the @theme because it's a Tailwind thing, we actually need to make this valid CSS. So just temporarily, I'm going to write body. So now it's detected the color. We can hover over the color swatch and then click this title bar until we see OKLCH. There we go. Okay, so that looks good. So let's go back to @theme. And then we will save. So now we have our custom color all set. And because we added it in our Tailwind theme, we can now go back to our index.html file. And then in here, instead of the square brackets with the custom color, we can start typing BG-dark blue. And it shows up there. So now we can save. Let's go back to our website. And when it reloads, we're using the same background color that we had earlier. So let's inspect it. And if we go to the body tag and go to the rules, we can see that, here we go. In the utilities layer, we have the class BG dark blue, which is what we added to our body tag. And we have the background color, and it's set to the color that we added in our theme. Okay, so this is how we can customize colors. Let's also customize the font family that we're using. So let's go back to the docs. And let's scroll down the theme variables page. And here we go. Here is some fonts. And these are the default fonts that Tailwind uses. So by default, Tailwind's going to load the sans serif font family. But let's change that to make it load Arial instead. So I'm going to go to our CSS file, and in our theme, I'm going to create yet another custom property. And we want to start this with font, so Tailwind knows that it's a font. And I'm going to say Arial. And then we'll set it to Arial sans serif. Okay, so now if we go back to our index.html, in the body tag again, let's add it after our background color. We can now add font, and you can see we have font Arial, and it's loading the Arial font. So now we can save. You can see our font kind of changed. So if we inspect some text here, if we scroll down, you can see that it's loading font Arial class, and it's loading the font, the Arial font family. And you can do the same thing, if you want to load a Google font or other custom font file. Now, another thing that I would like to customize is the grid columns for our cards instead of, hard coding this whole repeat and min-max function, because, it would be nice to be able to reuse this for future grids without having to copy and paste the code. Now, unfortunately for the grid calls utility class, they don't seem to let you create a, like a custom property, kind of like we did with the colors and the fonts. Like grid calls, let's say autofit, and then set it to this value. Tailwind's just not set up to detect it. My guess is because there's too many possible values that could go in here. So you can't do it in the theme, but you can create your very own custom utility class. So if we look up simple utilities, what we can do is use the @utility directive to add a custom utility class basically to your project. So what we can do is, instead of using the @theme, we can say @utility, and then we want to write the name of the utility that we want to use. So I'm going to say grid calls auto fit. Then in the curly brackets, we add in the actual code we want to use. So let's cut that and delete from where we had the theme. And then, sorry, we need to actually do the whole CSS property too. So grid template columns. There we go. And now this is our custom utility that we have now registered in Tailwind. So if we go back to our index.html on our website, now instead of that whole grid columns with the custom CSS, we can say grid calls autofit, and it detects it. And you can see this is the CSS that it's going to output, which is what we just created. So there we go. So let's save. And now we have our grid, which seems to be working correctly. Let's inspect it just to see what's going on. So we have our class grid calls autofit down here. And if we scroll down, you can see here in the utilities, we have the grid calls autofit class, and then the CSS style rule that we added in our utility here. And if we look back at this utility that we just made, you might notice that it's basically the same thing as, let's say, making a class selector for the class grid calls autofit. It would basically achieve the same thing. However, at least registering it as a Tailwind utility means that Tailwind will detect it in your autocomplete, and when you hover over the class, it'll show you a preview. So, if you want it to work within how Tailwind has set things up, then using the utility is, I think, a good solution. And this is just a simple utility example. You can do more complex examples where you actually add arguments and stuff to make more dynamic values. So I do recommend checking out the custom utilities and just seeing what else is possible with them, because they are quite powerful. All right, so I wanted to show you a couple more advanced CSS features that you can use with Tailwind. So let's look at the cards section. And let's say that I wanted to change the gradient direction of every other card. So instead of going from top right to bottom left, we would have every other card go from bottom left to top right. So let's do a test. Just on the first card, we're going to change the gradient just to see how it looks. So instead of 2BL, we'll say 2TR for top right. All right, so now you can see the gradient on the first card has flipped, and then the next one is going the original direction. And I think that looks pretty good to me. So let's undo this, go back to what we had before. And I mentioned that I would like to flip every other card. Now in CSS, you can target every other element in a group of elements with the Nth-Child pseudo-class selector. So you can use Nth-Child to target the first child, last child, odd-numbered children, even-numbered children, and any repeating number of child elements within a group. So one thing to note for when you're using Nth-Child selectors is that the order matters first. So we're looking at a group of elements, and the cards are in the same group as the H2 tag, and they're all children of the section tag here. So the first child is actually going to be the H2 tag. And then the second child will be the first card, and then the third child would be the second card, and so on. So with that in mind, I think I'm going to try to target the even numbered children, meaning that we'll start with the second child, which is the first card. And then we'll do the fourth child, which is the third card, and then the sixth child, which is the fifth card. So let's see how to do that in Tailwind. So in the docs, let's search for even child. So you can see nth child even. That's how you do it in CSS. And it's in the hover, focus, and other states page, which we have used quite a bit. And I do recommend just reading through this page. It is very long because there's a lot of different things you can do. Just to show you what you can do in Tailwind. Okay, so for the even numbered child, or children, I should say, you can target them with the even colon variant before whatever style you want. All right, so let's add that class to our code. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to leave the BG linear to BL, the original one, because this is going to be the default style for the cards. And then after that, I want to add the even colon variant style to all of these card divs. Now, I do want to make this change to all the cards because in a real environment, you would most likely be using a framework to generate all of the markup as a component, so they would all have identical HTML. But since we don't have a framework, in order to change all the classes, I'm going to use this trick in VS Code where you can use multiple cursors. So to do this, let's first select BG linear to BL, and you might notice that VS Code will highlight any matches. And I know that this class only exists in the cards. So now let's add multiple cursors with the hotkey Control-Shift-L or Command-Shift-L on Macs. And now it's going to place a cursor anywhere where this class exists. So now we can make the same change multiple times all at the same time. So we do still have that class selected, so I don't want to delete that. So I'm going to press the right arrow just to get out of the selection. Then we can press space. We can add our new class. So even colon BG dash linear to TR for top right. And so you might notice we have added it to all the cards. So now let's save our changes. All right, so now you can see that every other card starting with the even numbered child is now going from the bottom left to the top right. And then the odd numbered children are using the original direction for the gradient. All right, so this is nice because it just makes the cards look a little bit different and not too samey when you have a grid. So in addition to pseudo classes like the Nth-Child Selector that we were using, as well as hover states, CSS also has what's called pseudo-elements that you can target. Pseudo-elements are elements that don't exist explicitly in the HTML itself, but they can be generated and changed in your CSS. Some examples of CSS pseudo-elements would be form text box placeholder text, as well as the list symbols when you have a bulleted or a numbered list. And there are other pseudo-elements that we're going to be working with here called before and after. Now, these are child elements that you can create for basically any element. And again, they won't exist in the markup itself, but you can style and even add content to them in your CSS. So let me show you what I mean. So in the cards, if I hover over one of the read more links, what I want to do is I would like to make an angle bracket appear after the read more text. And we could do this by creating a span inside the anchor link. But for cases like this, it's sometimes just more convenient to create it as a pseudo element of the anchor link. So let's go to the Tailwind docs and search for pseudo element. There we go. And it's on that same page again. So here is before and after, and we can see how to add them using Tailwind. So I want to use after because I want the angle bracket to appear after the read more text. So in this example, we have actually kind of a similar example where this form label for email has this red asterisk at the end of it. And in the markup for the label, we have it added here with the after variant, so after colon. And we have different styles. We have a margin left, then it's text red. And then here's kind of where we can add the content here. So content dash, and then in square brackets, the asterisk is added inside some quotes. So this is what we kind of want to do as well. So I'm going to copy this, the after content, and let's go back to our site. And this is going to be the after pseudo element of the anchor link. So we'll add this in after content, and then instead of asterisk, I will add a right angled bracket. So now when we save, we can see the angle bracket on that first card. And let me just zoom in so you can see better. And there we go. Now we do need to make some changes to that. I think we want to add some more space on the left side. So we can do that with, again, after, and we'll say margin left, and let's do 2 for 8 pixels of margin left. Okay, so it looks better. And what I also want to do is I want to fade in this angle bracket symbol on hover. So I think the best way to do this is to initially set the opacity of the after pseudo element to 0, and we can fade it in because you can easily animate the opacity property to be opaque and not transparent anymore. So we'll add another after, and then opacity, and initially we'll set it to 0. So when we save, it has disappeared, which is correct. And I want to show it on hover. So we'll say hover, colon, after, colon, and then opacity. And it looks like this is a percentage thing, so we'll go all the way to 100 for 100% opacity. And then we also want to kind of smoothly animate it, so let's add a transition. And we should be able to, yeah, transition just opacity. Okay. So now you can see it's not fading in. Oh, I think I need to add the after. There we go. All right, so now it's smoothly fading in and then fading out on hover. All right, so, this looks pretty good to me. So now let's add this to the other cards. So I think what I'm going to do is I want to try to do the multiple cursor thing. So I'm going to select all the after, oh my gosh. I'm going to select all the after properties, and I'm going to cut it with Control X or Command X on Max so that all the classes will be the same for the different readmes. And then it's saved in our clipboard. So I'm going to select all of these, and hopefully it'll match. Yeah, there we go. So we'll do Control Shift L or Command Shift L on Max. And we've added the multiple cursors, which looks good. So now I'll do right arrow to get out of the selection, space, and then paste it in. So now looks like, yeah, we've added them to all the read more links. There we go. Cool. So, like I've said, there are a lot of other pseudo classes and pseudo elements in CSS that you can target in Tailwind. So I do recommend checking out this page just to see what's possible. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about some more custom styles that you can do in Tailwind using layers and components. Now with Tailwind, we've been adding utility classes to each element in order to style them. However, it can get a little bit tedious to have to keep adding repeated styles for some things. For example, as we mentioned before, Tailwind by default is going to remove the font weight bold style for all H tags. This means that we've had to manually re-add the font bold class to our H1 tag, H2 tag, and H3 tags. And to be honest, I would prefer that all the H tags were just automatically bold. And so we can customize Tailwind to do exactly that by adding some what's called base styles to our style.css file. So let's go to our styles and let's go to the docs and search for base styles. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can add our own default base styles for specific HTML elements using the layer directive to add those styles to Tailwind's base layer. So we can do this for our H tags. Now in this example, we are working with the CSS layer that Tailwind has created. So CSS layers themselves are actually a CSS feature. They're not just a Tailwind thing. And layers let you organize your styles into groups of priority. And this will allow styles from one layer to override the styles in another layer. And this overriding behavior is what's called the cascade in CSS, cascading style sheets. But let's look at the layers that we currently have in Tailwind. So I'm going to right click to open our dev tools, and we want to navigate up at the top to the style editor. So here we have all of the Tailwind styles that are currently getting loaded from this inline style sheet. Now up at the top, we can see that we have a bunch of CSS layers. And let's kind of fold things up a bit so we can see things better. All right, so, and then don't worry about these. So the first layer here, this is the properties layer. I wouldn't worry too much about these. Tailwind is using them to add types and default values to some of these CSS custom properties that we've been using, like for example, the gradients. But after that are the main layers, and that's what we're really looking at here. So this first line here, it tells us the priority of the layers, where the latter layers are going to be able to override styles in the earlier layers. So we start with theme, then we have base, components, and then utilities. So this means that the last layer, I should say, utilities can override everything before it, components can override theme and base, and so on. So this is just the list of the priority of the layers. So below that, we have the actual layers themselves with all the different styles. So first, we have the theme layer. And the theme layer doesn't contain any actual style rules, you might notice. It just has a lot of custom properties. So these are the properties that Tailwind uses for, fonts, colors, and so on. And at the end of the theme layer, you might notice that it actually contains the custom properties that we added in our style.css file in that @theme directive here. So next up after the theme layer is the base layer. And these are global styles that Tailwind adds to all elements to, remove a lot of those default browser styles. So here's actually where all the H tags get their font weight bold removed. It's set to inherit instead. So after the base layer is the components layer according to this list. However, we don't have any component styles yet, but we are going to be creating some a little bit later on. And then after the components is the utilities layer. And again, the utilities is the last layer, so all these utility classes from Tailwind can override anything that comes from previous layers. And this order of priority is, basically the way that you would want to set up your styles if you're creating your own custom layers. Okay, so with all those CSS layers in mind, let's go back to our style.css file and create the new base style for the H tags. And the order doesn't really matter here because we already have that list of the layer priority in Tailwind. So we can create this in basically anywhere we want. So we're going to add styles to the base layer. To do this, we want to write @layer, and then the name of the layer that we want to add to. And this is going to add styles in here to the base layer that exists already. So in this layer, let's write the selector for the different H tags. I'm going to say H1, H2, and I'll just stop at H3 since that's what we're actually using in our website. Then for the style, we'll say font weight 700 for bold. There we go. So now we can save that, and let's remove all of the font bold classes from our HTML. So this is removing it from the H1 tag, H2 tag, and we do have multiple H3 tags. So let's do the multiple selector thing, Control-Shift-L. Now we have multiple cursors. We'll use the arrow tag to then remove font bold from all the cards. Just double checking here. There we go. So now the H3 tags just have the text large class. Okay, so let's save that. So we saved and our H tags are still bold, which is a good thing. So let's inspect and see what's going on there. So for the H1 tag, let's scroll down. You can see here the base layer has the font weight set to 700. And just as kind of a side note, when you look at the styles and the rules tab, this actually also tells you the sort of specificity of the styles. So the ones that are at the top have the highest specificity. So that's why the utility styles are at the top. And then as we go down, now we have the base styles. So that's kind of how that works for in our dev tools. And let's go back to our style editor, and in our base styles, let's see where this shows up. So here's the original one that we're trying to kind of cancel out. Might be towards the bottom here. Here we go. So here's the other base layer that we added, and we have set the font weight to 700 for the H1, H2, and H3 tags. And again, it's okay that we have two base layers. They still are going to be considered as belonging to the same layer in the final website. All right, so that's the layers. Next up, let's make some more custom styles in the components layer. Now, the upside of using Tailwind is that you can use their pre-made design styles for colors, spacing, and more, and you don't need to worry about, creating a CSS class names and organizing your styles to avoid style conflicts. However, the downside of Tailwind is that you do end up with just a lot of classes in your HTML elements. And if you're reusing a given element in different parts of your website, then it can be a bit annoying to have to copy and paste all the styles in your classes. For example, the button that we have here, buttons are an element that we would most likely be reusing in multiple places on this website, if we had more pages and stuff like that. And usually in the real world, you would be using a framework or templating of some sort to create the button as a component, and then you could just load this wherever you need it. But it might be overkill to, create a whole component just for this one button, because it's kind of a more simple element. So in cases like this, it might actually be most efficient to create a CSS class for button and to put all these styles in the CSS. Now we would want to put these styles in the components layer so that they can override the base layer styles, but they can still be able to be overridden in turn by styles in the utility layer. So let's start by creating a component for this button. So in our styles, I'm going to, after the base layer, let's write at layer components. Then inside the curly bracket, I'm going to create the class selector for button. Now in here, we could write, just straight up regular CSS, but Tailwind actually has a specialized directive called apply that you can use to apply the Tailwind class styles in your CSS. So here's how it works. If I go back to the HTML, I'm going to select all the classes that we added to the button, and I'm going to cut them and just replace it with button. Then let's go back to our CSS, and for that button class, I'm going to write at apply and then paste in all those classes from the button. And let's wrap our text here. So now you can see the full style rule. And this is just kind of a VS Code. It can't detect this, but it will work in Tailwind. So we've saved our styles and we saved just the button class in the HTML, and on the website, the button looks exactly the way it did before. So let's right click and inspect it. And now we can see that we have in the components layer, the button class, and it has all the CSS styles that are coming from these classes that we used apply for in our styles. So this is a really nice way of being able to access the Tailwind styles from your CSS. However, I do need to give you a word of warning. You want to be very careful not to overuse apply, because if you start creating, a ton of these custom CSS classes and using apply, you have to make sure that your styles in your CSS file are organized so that you don't unintentionally create style conflicts. And, the whole reason to use Tailwind is that you don't need to worry about CSS. And it's more efficient because, all the different elements are reusing the same class names with these styles. And, it is totally fine to use apply in specific use cases, especially if you understand CSS and how the cascade works and how to best organize your styles. Now, if you're not super confident in your CSS skills and how to format your project files, then you might be interested in my course called Build a Responsive Website. In it, I show you step-by-step how to build a responsive, accessible website with HTML, pure CSS, and JavaScript from a custom Figma design. Now, at the time of recording, it is currently on sale, so check it out if you want. I do use PPP pricing, and I also have an interest-free monthly payment plan to help make this course more affordable, no matter where in the world you live. All right, so thanks for watching this video mini course on Tailwind CSS, and we'll see you in the next one.